Jean-François, bon, j'ai des choses, more than one, to actually bring up to you. But before I forget, I would be remiss if I did not mention your article in Le Devoir, where I think I think the line was, if you really want to know what's happening with Quebec separation, read Toronto newspapers or read the dailies. So what's this all about?
Well, it's Heaven's Separatist was the title. And it says, well, in the last few days, writers in The Walrus, Gerald Butts, the former advisor to Justin Trudeau, and Andrew Coyne in the Globe and Mail, have both written extensively on the coming separatist threat. And I thought it was interesting that they come around to this, because you and I and our listeners know that the threat has been there for a while, and that the PQ is bound to win the next election, or it's their election to lose. We can put it that way. And so I'm always very interested in seeing how our colleagues in Toronto view things. And it was interesting how both Butts and Coyne did not trust Poilievre to really handle the situation that will come his way. They both feel that, and also Chris Selly in the National Post had a good column in May that I quote there. They're both saying that they should do nothing. If the PQ wins and the Bloc at the election has a large contingent and they start the referendum process, Canada should offer nothing to Quebec, because they say there's no way that support for independence will be strong enough and meet the criteria of the misnamed Clarity Bill. So might as well do nothing and let them lose.
Yeah, I guess what I took from the column as well is, hey, look, they're paying attention. That's been a long time since I felt the need to, right? As far as separation goes.
Yes. I will always remember a column by Jeffrey Simpson just the week before the referendum in 95, saying it's tragic how previous governments have not created conditions for Quebec to not contemplate independence. I say, well, Jeffrey, you've been writing for years that you should not give more autonomy to Quebec, and now you're just waking up to the fact that at some point, since Quebecers want autonomy, they'll turn to their second choice, which is independence. So,
okay, I wonder how much of this, maybe it's, I don't know if you can answer the question, how much do you think has to do with not so much the polling, which shows the PQ, of course, ahead, and it has been for a while, but with Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon specifically?
Well, the columns really almost don't mention Plamondon at all. They are worried that Poilievre will react in a feisty, juvenile manner. That's Coyne's expression, and will somehow exacerbate the situation with Quebec rather than being calm and steadfast. And that's my big takeaway. Another takeaway from Gerald Butts is that the constant negative rhetoric about Canada in the last few years has weakened the attractivity of Canada for all Canadians, including Quebecers, and that is a factor.
Okay, let me go to something else. I'm sure you saw this story as well today. There's been a lot of talk. I remember talking to Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon a few months ago when we did a podcast, and he laid out the financial future on day one, right, if Quebec would separate. And today, there is a reaction, some people getting together, Andre Pratt among them, to say, and I'm just going to read real quickly here, it says, the year one budget that the PQ released rests on, quote, unrealistic premises and regrettable omissions. This is according to 3 economists who put this together. You saw it. What do you think?
Well, it's just par for the course. I mean, the only thing that surprises me about this 20-page paper is that it took them a year to write. I mean, I could have written it in 24 hours, knowing what the rhetoric has been in the last 50 years. And so some of the arguments are fair and should be debated. Some of the arguments are a bit odd, because what the PQ did in his one-year budget was simply a pro forma exercise if Quebec were to carry exactly the same programs as the federal government with exactly the same the same budgets, what would it look like? And then these guys are saying, but you're not spending enough on defense. You should be spending 2% of GDP on defense. That's $8 billion that you didn't count. Well, listen, Canada has not been spending 2% on defense ever. And why should the Quebec independent government in its first year decide to do that? This is just, you're just moving the goalpost. The other big thing they say is that for 30 years now, every time this exercise has been done, the consensus is that the Canadian debt will be shared with Quebec according to the amount of assets that the federal government has in Quebec. And so that's 17%, 18% of the total of the assets of the Canadian government are in Quebec. So that means the federal government invested assets in Quebec during all that time. And they say, no. They will use the proportion of the population. Well, if they do that, then you didn't count $56 billion worth of debt. And then you turn around and say, well, okay, so if that's true, then we can buy for $56 billion of assets all elsewhere in Canada because, these things are done based on debt and assets. And so they're changing the methodology that has been used by the Bourassa government at the time when they did the exercise. And if you change the methodology, you can go anywhere you want.
They also point out, tell me what you think about this. They say the PQ document, this finance document, makes no mention of the fate of about 60,000 Quebecers who work in the federal public service.
That is true. They make no mention because it's a pro forma budget. But certainly since it says that it will spend the proportion of Quebec in defense, that means that all these employees who are in defense at Valcartier and the Vendus and all that will be employed by Quebec, and everyone working in the post office will be employed by Quebec, and certainly a share of the federal public service. But the budget, the number one, the year one budget was not meant to show what choices, and maybe choices that will be less costly, an independent Quebec would make. That was the point of the method. I wish that at some point they'll say, well, now that we know what the pro forma cost would be, let's see what choices we will make that will be even less costly. And one of the part of this debate, which we had at every time we had a referendum, is will we commit to rehire every one of the federal employees or not? Last time the answer was yes. This time the answer might be no, but that means that maybe 70% are sure to have their jobs because they're working in Quebec, in the post office and others, but some who are working in Ottawa will not be sure. So that's a debate to be had.
Okay, so if there's a debate to be had on some of these points, how do you react to Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon coming out, reacting to this, calling it, and I'm quoting, a fear campaign from the no camp? If there's items to be discussed, why would you simply say that? Why don't we not be able to say, you know what, we should sit down and take a look at some of these points. They have merit.
Well, I heard him today, and he said both things. He said it's the old fear campaign when you're changing the methodology to put all the worst possible hypotheses. There's a political will to be fearful. And I haven't read the whole document. I read the parts of it, and it's clear that you're making assumptions to make the worst case scenario. Now, worst case scenarios sometimes happen. They don't always happen. But I heard him say that there will be a point-by-point response from someone in the PQ in the days to come. And frankly, as a sovereigntist, I welcome this debate. It will never be settled. There will never be a time before the next referendum when we'll have a common assessment of what will happen in the future. By the same token, at the last at the 80 referendum, no one told us that the Canadian debt would quadruple and that the Canadian dollar would drop to 65 cents. There are too many unknowns in the future in any case. But it's important that both narratives coexist. There's maybe the rosy narrative of the PQ, and there's the fearful narrative of the no camp. And it will never be resolved unless and until we actually have a country.
That's a pretty big gamble to take for most people, isn't it?
Well, when you left your family to have your own apartment, you took quite a chance.
Yeah, that's an individual. You're talking here about 9 or 10 million people who you're asking to basically take the same chance and hope for the best.
Well, there's more than 40 new countries that appeared since the 1980s. So sometimes you think that it's better to take this chance, to be bold, than to suffer in silence.
Just as a final question, so would it be fair to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that there is really no serious financial risk involved in an independent Quebec?
I think there's a serious financial risk involved in staying in Canada. When oil booms, the Canadian dollar is overvalued and it destroys manufacturing jobs in Quebec. Last time that happened, we lost 50,000 good manufacturing jobs. Now, that was never promised to us that if we stayed, we would suffer from an oil boom that doesn't give us any money. So there is financial uncertainty on both sides. We know that some countries, like when Czechoslovakia seceded, so Slovakia had a boom of the GDP in the very next years. Others did not fare so well. The discussion we had with Jacques Parizeau at the time, he said, listen, if we're incompetent, we're going to have bad outcomes. And if we're competent, we're going to have good outcomes.
And that's where we will leave it. Jean-François, thank you. Merci. Talk to you again next week.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.